I am a noted enjoyer of fantasy, science fiction, science fantasy, all of that kind of thing. And one of the commonly explored themes across these genres is how humans, using that term as broadly as possible, interact with the non human, or one might say alien elements of the worlds they inhabit, which is a really interesting premise that's executed with varying degrees of competence throughout the pantheon of stories that explore these elements. Humans stand alone. So far as we know, we are the only thing that is like us. Bipedal, intelligent, relatively speaking, and capable of great feats of engineering and problem solving. There is nothing on Earth that can really compete with us directly in that way, or if there was, they've been driven to extinction, and we're quite literally the last man standing, which makes it an interesting exercise to imagine, what if we weren't alone? Either because there are in fact little green men, or because we place humans in a fantasy world where we're face to face with other beings who are our equals, which would put us in an interesting position. Would we be friendly? Would we regard them as an unacceptable challenge and seek to outcompete them? How would they react to us? In order to make these questions interesting, the aliens that we often encounter in fiction aren't really aliens. Now, I know how that sounds, but it is something that I've noticed and has been pointed out to me by a friend who inspired this video. Think about it for a second. Your typical alien, as I'll define it in a bit, in a fantasy or sci-fi setting, is usually some kind of bipedal, vaguely human-shaped being who lives their lives in a way that is familiar to us or familiar to the humans in the setting. They live in societies, they have culture, they speak, usually with a mouth. They're just humans, which I suppose leads nicely to me having to explain what I mean by the term alien when I use it in this video. There was another inspiration for this video, which was a video by Pay Talks Anime called When the Protagonist Feels Alien, where they explored this archetype of protagonists that are aliens. Using two of my favorite animes, they used Frieren from Frieren, go figure, and Laios from Dungeon Meshi as examples. And is that how you pronounce that name in English? That's how you pronounce it in Turkish, so I'm pronouncing it like that. It's a good video, and the definition they use for the general case, which is when a character is structured to be disconnected from the audience, is a good starting point from the audience character perspective. The video goes on to talk about this in the context of those two protagonists, but that's not what this video is about. And it's not what I'm interested in right now. My interest is not protagonists, but who or what the protagonists interact with. Because the final inspiration for talking about this is the D&D campaign I run on this channel with some of my good friends, and as the DM, I never play the protagonist. I play characters that are variously heroic, villainous, anti-heroic, but never the protagonist. I'm all the bad guys, and most of the good guys, and I'm also every single weird and wonderful creature from an aboleth to literal gods, which means I impose an expanded definition of alien for my purposes, which, through my own difficulties trying to meet it, made this issue apparent to me. So let me take my turn to define an alien for my purposes. An alien is an entity or being whose fundamental experience of and interactions with the world is so radically different to that of a human that there's permanently a gap between them. Whether that's for a physiological, cultural, or any other reason, there must be an aspect of the experience of the alien that is totally alienated from us. That doesn't mean there can't be similarities or points of contact that can create empathy, but it must always be distant from us. You can probably already think of examples where opportunities would emerge. Hold on to those. We might talk about that in a little bit. Who knows? Video essay moment. We're talking about it in a little bit. I want to provide an example where this doesn't happen, despite the subject clearly being an alien in the sense that they're clearly not the type of person we are. They're not like this. Probably. If you are an alien and you're watching this, you have to let me know. That's the law, actually. If I ask, you have to tell me. My go-to example for this is the Ferengi in Star Trek. Now, I can already hear all the objections about to roll in, and I know, and we'll talk about why they are like that and why other aliens are like that, but I just want to concentrate on what they are and just how human they are. I will concede that if you're walking in your local town or city, you're not going to see someone who looks like this with big ears and sharp teeth. Despite this, they are human-shaped, bipeds with a face and eyes, all of the stuff you'd expect. They are capable of the range of emotions that we're familiar with and express them in familiar ways. The Ferengi's mode of production is capitalism. If anything, they are extreme capitalists who solely focus on profit and capital accumulation. They are extreme misogynists on the personal and institutional level, and they are extremely hierarchical and deferential to that hierarchy. This is a guy you have met. Admittedly, it's probably a guy who you've met who immediately tells you about the Joe Rogan podcast or about how cool Elon Musk is, but this guy exists. Ferengi are just guys. Weird, capitalist, misogynist guys. And yes, there are also women Ferengi, and actually I think some of the more interesting stories are about them. But for the most part, we see that masculine side of the Ferengi. And yeah, it's all very human. None of this diminishes the Ferengi. It may shock you to know that I am in fact a Deep Space Nine person, and some of the best episodes feature our boy Quark significantly. Also, Rom unionizing the bar fucking rules.
Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains.
But that's the point. In the case of Star Trek, the Ferengi and pretty much all of the aliens aren't meant to be incomprehensible to us. They're supposed to be a way for there to be interesting cultural contact between different societies and hold up a mirror to humanity as it existed at the time and exists in the show, since sci-fi is, a reflection of the present rather than about the actual future. For that reason, the Star Trek, and if we're being honest, general sci-fi trope of entire alien species being just some human with the trait turned up to 11 can be interesting. How does an excessive expression of one particular aspect of humanity change how individuals in that society interact with each other, with other cultures? How does it impact things like their government or their religion? That's the advantage of having these human aliens, and it's tailor-made for what Star Trek, or at least the Star Trek stuff that I like, seeks to be and achieve. One method, one intended depiction isn't inherently better than the other. It depends on what a story calls for, which I think brings us conveniently back to my particular challenge in my writing for the D&D campaign. So let's talk a little bit about my boy Brian. I did just mention the D&D campaign, so I may as well plug it. Every 2 weeks or so, me and some friends, including John the Duncan and Bridget Empire, do a D&D stream called The Adventures of Team Normal. Don't ask, they picked the name for the team. That's nothing to do with me, which oddly is going to be a recurring theme here. You should check it out though, it's good fun, and because of that I do need to give a warning to exactly 4 people, 50% of which I'm sure will be watching this. If you're in Team Normal, you might not want to watch this because it might give you an insight into how I run the sessions or create characters for it, and that might ruin it for you. I don't know if it will, but just in case, I appreciate you watching up until now. Just think about if you want to know how this particular sausage is made. You've been warned. Everyone else, you're good. You're good. This is going to be fine. So one of the things that I have to come to terms with, as any DM has to come to terms with, is the fact that no matter how much work and consideration I put into a character, how long they're part of a campaign is ultimately up to the party. I run the campaign as a sandbox, and if I wave the obvious quest in their face with the really interesting quest giver, that means nothing if they decide they want to go and have a beauty pageant using prisoners of war. Yes, that really did happen in the campaign. It was great. And it did spawn an NPC who stuck around, who I also kind of like, but is less interesting for this purpose. And I'm okay with that, because I am a bit of an improviser, but also because it's a hazard of the role. One of my favourite characters I wrote for this campaign was only there for, I want to say, 3 sessions or so. It was an Illithid who was separated from his people, who they found hunched over a corpse he was examining. He ended up being such an interesting character to play because at his core, he is a monster. I run a homebrew setting, so this isn't quite your Forgotten Realms situation where they are inherently evil aberrations, but to the extent that Brian lived life as an individual who considered their own needs, they were all considered selfishly and in the name of things the player characters couldn't relate to or would find abhorrent. I wanted to play him as a proper alien to them, not like an elf who's just lived a long time, but as something where the gap appeared to be insurmountable. Now, whether I succeeded or not, I'll leave that to the players to decide, who ended up kind of liking him, and maybe they got Brian to crack a joke by the end of their time together. You could even tell me what you think, but there was one challenge looking back that I had on my mind the whole time. To me, there are really two common outcomes when you want to present an alien character to protagonists. And there's one that applies to Brian and one that doesn't, but they exist sort of on a spectrum. So let's start with the one that doesn't. On the one end of the spectrum, you have the kind of creature, entity, being that exists in such a different way or different scale to your protagonists that they are functionally irrelevant in terms of character interactions. Now, for us as humans, that's a massive proportion of things that exist, where unless we have a scientific interest or are unlucky, we don't really have to consider the anything to do with them, let alone their internality. One example I thought of was a slime mold. If I encounter a slime mold, it exists in such a different way to me that the gap is insurmountable. Like, I can't come to an understanding with it. And unless I was whatever type of scientist studies slime molds, I don't care. And in a narrative, you wouldn't expect protagonists to care about something like that. Now, I can hear you all typing now, like, what if there was a special slime mold that was doing this thing, but maybe it wasn't deliberate, or it was possessed by a wizard of some kind? You know, you're all going to be saying stuff like that to me. And you see how that requires something additional to what it is, right? There's something going on that narrows that gap, and now I have to create a slime mold villain for D&D, so that's cool. And I guess we'll see if I can manage it, but you've moved it along the spectrum towards the other end, which in itself has some components that are specific to Brian that we'll get into, but let's speak in the more general case first. The opposite end of the spectrum from total irrelevance, slime mold stuff, is a kind of alien that exists in a way where we are concerned with it, but also understand it as a threat. The kind of thing where the standards it lives by, or its instincts, or what it does, or wants to do is so threatening that it's immediately and only an antagonist. A pretty good example, if you'll sort of ignore the ending fiasco, is the Reapers from Mass Effect. What they want is to harvest all intelligent life in the galaxy for the purposes of preservation. And this naturally is such an affront and such a bizarre sort of thing to be confronted with that it elicits a violent resistance from most of the galaxy who haven't already fallen under their spell. Or you might think of the Tyranids from 40k, or the Xenomorph, though as I recall things do get weird in that series as it goes on, but like, I didn't really watch a lot of it. I kind of got fed up with it. But just something where the gap is so large that you can only conceive of it as a threat, and the only way to resolve it is to compromise them to a permanent end. Given human history, if something that we can get our hands on is a threat to us, we generally don't put up with it for very long. Both of these extremes have their place and their uses. I'm not saying these are bad. Like, you can have the irrelevant set dressing or even objects of curiosity, and you can have galaxy-ending robots that turn you into like a metallic sludge. Nothing is wrong with any of that. It just wasn't what I wanted to do here. I didn't want Brian to be a kind of brain-eating mushroom, and I didn't want him to be perceived immediately or even through the course of his interactions as so threatening that he needed to be put down. Which does bring me to the specific issue I faced with Brian. I'm going to just come out guns blazing, I'm going to put the blame for this on Baldur's Gate 3, which is a great, fun game, but it did make aspects of this harder, which is that no matter how strict or how honest your players are, they do a bit of the metagaming. Now, I personally don't mind that, so long as it's not obnoxious. Like, I will let players talk strategy mid-fight, because sometimes I'm a bit of a dick when I balance my combat encounters, and they know if they're still watching, they can confirm it. There is just an element of it that's unavoidable, and as a player, your perception does impact how you act in the game, and generally speaking, when you see a figure hunched over a corpse, tentacles reaching from its mouth as it looks with what appears to be hunger from its glowing orange eyes. Then one of your players says, "It's a Mindflayer." The term Mindflayer does kind of colour how that's all going to play out. Usually it plays out with a boot to the Mindflayer's skull, which would have been a totally valid way for the players to react and play. It would have been a waste of an idea I had for them, but that's the game, right? I've already hazarded the job. It was up to me to make him sufficiently compelling that they thought at least some of the gap could be closed. This is a general challenge for DMs, and I imagine people who write these kinds of stories, it's just hard sometimes. First of all, you need to create the gap, and in a D&D campaign, this could go from Brian, who eats brains, all the way up to literal gods, which my party has forced me to play at times. These each present their own challenge and their own degree of separation from the protagonists. And so you have to make them compelling without making them so threatening they have to immediately be murdered. In the case of a god, they can be aloof, they can have bigger fish to fry, and that gap kind of has to be maintained because, it's a god, right? It's not like your typical D&D campaign always ends in attacking and dethroning God. Just most of them do. With Brian, I wanted to keep him odd, make him a bit off-putting. Part of that was in the way he communicated, via telepathy, an alien voice in your head. That can be very uncomfortable, even threatening. It was a fine balancing act, and a fun challenge, honestly, trying to thread the needle of being obviously different at a fundamental level, but tantalizing the party with the gap being, there, but narrower than it might have otherwise been. So how did I do that? Firstly, when I introduced them, they were in a position of relative weakness and confusion. Now, the party didn't know this, but once he met them, he did have some ulterior motives towards them, but decided to honour the agreement that they made because he was after a much more satisfying prize, which was the Medusa who was building an empire of vanity under this mining colony. It's a fun campaign. I like what I do sometimes I just really like what I do. Because he was weak, the party's natural empathy kicked in, and that meant they could tolerate his presence, which would give me a lot of opportunities to showcase his struggle with a new form of being and individuality and agency that they'd never had before, and show the party how he was making at least what he thought was a sincere effort to cooperate. It's easier to play the Illithids, in their underground cities where they're plotting world domination. It's quite something else to play an individual isolated from that, trying to survive and learn how to be, and that was the point of contact that narrowed the gap. No matter how fundamentally rotten the background, survival, which is what Brian was really after, is a pretty strong motivator, and it's a way to make connections because everyone wants to survive, right? If something wants to survive, it has something to live for, and that's relatable to players or readers or viewers or whatever. The challenge to me was to try to imagine an experience that was mostly, if not totally, outside that of a human experience. And Illithid, both in Forgotten Realms and in the homebrew setting for the campaign I run on here, do not live in a society that would be familiar to any of us. They don't have relationships the way that we do. They don't reproduce the way that we do. Such that there is a society, it is centered on an elder brain, a big monstrous brain that essentially houses all of their knowledge and pumps their minds full of dreams of conquest. Everyone is part of a hive mind controlled by that brain. They're totally obedient to it and its visions of conquest and domination, all while they retain just enough agency to vie for power under the Elder Brain. Some of this might feel a little familiar, but the fundamentals of it, the total physiological obedience enforced to the point where even if they become independent, the second they're back in the grasp of the Elder Brain, they fall right back into it. Nothing about them is like us. Then here's one that meets us, and he can't be such an aberrant monstrosity that the Paladin immediately slices him in half, which, if I'm recalling correctly, he did kind of want to do, which, again, fair enough, it was in character. Look, this section was mostly me trying to make my point by talking about a character that I really want to worm back into my ongoing D&D campaign, but I think he does illustrate the nature of the challenge, because yes, you can absolutely have a monstrous threat or a Lovecraftian horror that is of such a scale that it shatters your mind. That's not the only way to make something feel suitably alien. But yeah, I love Brian. Great character, great case study, great excuse to plug the D&D streams, terrible name. And I did let the party name him, so I kind of did this to myself, threading that needle even though I think I didn't quite get it perfectly right and maybe made him a bit too close to the party in the end, but hey, you know, I'm an improviser, it happens. It was a nice experiment and it gave me an understanding for why we often see these human-like aliens more often where we can empathize with them. They reflect something about ourselves back at us, not because it's easy necessarily, but because it allows exploration of themes beyond the big scary aliens, even though that is really fun. Okay, so this video went to places I didn't expect, like being a giant advert for the D&D stream. I hope you all found Brian interesting because I enjoyed playing them a lot. I was thinking about media I'd experienced where this worked, and I happen to be replaying the original Mass Effect trilogy, which means my mind has inevitably gone to the Geth, which is also why I mentioned the Reapers from Mass Effect earlier. Yeah, if you can't tell. For those unfamiliar, the Geth are pretty much your main antagonist in the first game. They are a synthetic life form that are kind of freaky looking, and some of them move in very annoying ways that may frustrate the less skilled or rusty player, some might say, I don't know. In Mass Effect 2, you briefly, as I recall, haven't got to 2 yet, but I do recall it being brief, you do get a Geth companion called Legion. You do get a choice, you can either sell Legion or keep him and activate him. If you choose to activate him, you get insights into the Geth and their society, and one of the details that always sticks out to me is when you do Legion's loyalty mission, and the characters remark on how the Geth space station doesn't have windows, because of course it wouldn't, right? They don't need them, they don't want to look out into space, and as Legion explains their structural weaknesses, which is a really nice touch, actually. Another thing you learn is that a Geth, a single unit of Geth, is multiple programs working together, and the more they network, the more capable they are. They function as a direct and instant democracy. Legion, who much like our friend Brian is separate from his society, is made up of programs that make those decisions as they go. They also have this element of being what the game calls a synthetic, something that was created by an organic being, in this case the Quarians. It's very different to what we're used to on a number of levels, no matter what the AI enthusiasts tell us. We're not doing this, right? I think Mass Effects 1 and 2 do this quite well, where they set the Geth up as this weird, synthetic, distant life form, and it's helped by Tali being a companion in both games, who's from the people who created them, and they are pretty strongly polarized against them since the Geth drove them from their homeworld, being your only reliable source of information on them. Now, let's not get into Mass Effect 3 too much because that's dangerous territory, but depending on how you've played, you can close this gap entirely. But in the first 2 games, they get this dynamic pretty much right, I'd say. It's helped by Legion being present for so little time in Mass Effect 2. That limits the scope of pushing it too far in a way that means they would kind of mess it up. Though I do think they may have fumbled that aspect later on. It was to support a theme, so I guess it's okay, but we'll leave it there. That's a whole other video. That is to say, though, that when it works, it's very memorable and cool. So why did I struggle, and why do I think there's this tendency to either fumble it or just go for something totally different? Let me answer that by asking you to do something. Just as an exercise, Try to imagine the perspective of something that's totally alienated from humanity and how you'd attempt to bridge that gap while there are just the tempo of a story is happening. And it's kind of hard, right? A lot of the low-hanging fruit is either a slime mold or a monster, or a monstrous slime mold. Now that I think about it, Mass Effect did kind of do that with the Thorian, but we're leaving that for another time. It can be difficult to incorporate them in a role that isn't set dressing or a big scary monster or a wave of monsters devouring everything before them. At this point, given the twists and turns of this video, I'd like to ask you all something. Is there a piece of fiction, a book, a game, a movie that you think captures this kind of experience and aliens really well? Look, I'm genre agnostic, so don't worry. If you're going to suggest something that is not in my wheelhouse, I am open to it. I'm open-minded. One recommendation I got was from the person who will be proofreading the script, which is a book called Crossfire, which apparently involves sentient kangaroos and mushrooms, which sounds incredible. Just let me have all of your suggestions, and if you've ever written anything like this or run a D&D campaign or just any old creative stuff and had to do this kind of thing, just tell us about it in the comments. I'm genuinely really interested. That's our new vibe for a while here. This is something a bit different, even to what I had planned to do before, but it was interesting enough that as a topic that it did very well in the last topic poll the patrons voted on, so I thought, why not give you this one for free? So yeah, cheers everyone, hope you enjoyed it, and right, credits, move to the credits, go. I need to thank the proofreader who gave me some excellent notes on this one, excellent feedback, thank you very much to her. I also want to say if you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, subscribe, tell me all about your aliens that you find interesting, the media that depicts aliens interestingly, please tell me about them. I would be really intrigued to hear about them. And also I want to say a special thanks to the patrons and members. If you really enjoy the videos, please consider joining the Patreon or the YouTube membership program. They really, really do help the channel. They really motivate me to just sort of, keep putting stuff out there, keep trying new things. It gives me a level of confidence to try things like this. And I like trying things like this, even if they don't necessarily do well. That's not the point of it, right? But I want to thank the top tier patrons, Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kersey Scheider, John N, Liron, Jar Jar Muba, and Carolyn, absolute legends. And I want to thank our YouTube members, Nadir Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, Scaly Bubble, Ben Johnson. Special thank you to them as well. If you want your name read out, you got to go join that top tier on Patreon or the YouTube membership. Otherwise, yeah, that's our new vibe. Let me know if you like the new vibe, if you like this sort of more, I don't know, non-political, casual kind of fun, chatty thing. I don't know. I wanna move. I wanna, for the rest of the year, I wanna try some new stuff. I wanna have a bit of fun. I wanna cut loose. So, let me know if you like that sort of thing, and I'll catch you all on the next video.